Over the 12 months ending in late May 2026, the Russian military advanced across the Ukrainian theater to secure a net total of 1,495 square miles of earth. This geographic acquisition roughly equals the landmass of Rhode Island, representing a mere 0.6% of Ukraine. To acquire this specific sliver of farmland and shattered concrete, the Kremlin spent up to 1.1 million Russian soldiers killed or severely wounded. That means for every single square mile the military seized, more than 700 human lives vanished from the domestic ledger. A functional state encounters this ratio and flinches because domestic feedback loops impose a political stop-loss mechanism. The Kremlin operates without these safeguards because it does not manage a sovereign state in the traditional sense. It runs an organized criminal enterprise that happens to control a nuclear arsenal. For 4 decades, Western analysts dismissed this characterization by journalist David Satter as an eccentric hyperbole. Today, the internal architecture of Russia proves the diagnosis accurate. The current campaign no longer aims its primary momentum at external conquests like Kyiv. The machine has turned its weight inward, transforming the conflict into the largest domestic redistribution of property since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Western sanctions and corporate departures left behind billions of dollars in industrial hardware, real estate, and infrastructure. The syndicate did not liquidate these assets. It reallocated them to cement the absolute dependency of a new proprietor class. The administration maintains no central register of these nationalized holdings, rendering the total scale of the transfers structurally unquantifiable. This calculated lack of an audit trail serves a precise purpose. It prevents the formation of an alternative power base among the elite by ensuring that every title deed remains revocable at a moment's notice. The war creates the domestic emergency, the emergency justifies the confiscation, and the confiscation funds the internal network of loyalty. Even long-term compliance offers no immunity from this mechanism. In mid-2025, federal prosecutors dismantled the empire of Konstantin Strukov, a gold mining billionaire who had spent his career demonstrating absolute public fealty to the regime. The state stripped his control over Russia's third-largest gold producer, seized his domestic and offshore holdings, and canceled his passport at the border. This intervention signaled to the entire oligarchic tier that passive support no longer satisfies the system. The state now demands total asset integration since early 2025. These systematic asset seizures have recovered roughly $30 billion from homegrown industries previously considered untouchable. Yet even a total domestic asset harvest cannot sustain a militarized state budget indefinitely without an external cash injection. That injection arrived through the global energy market, triggered by geopolitical instability thousands of miles from the front line. The widening conflict in the Middle East drove a massive spike in global crude pricing. In March 2026, Russian oil export revenues surged to approximately $19 billion, up from less than $10 billion the previous month. This single fiscal windfall covered the immediate costs of domestic defense manufacturing without requiring direct cuts to public services. Every global consumer paying inflated prices at a Western gas station inadvertently stabilized the Kremlin's balance sheet. But this financial buffer also created a highly visible single point of failure that the opposing military spent the last year studying. Throughout the opening months of 2026, Ukrainian long-range drone networks executed more than 20 strategic strikes against the physical arteries of the Russian oil complex. These operations forced domestic energy firms to slash crude production by 400,000 barrels per day in April alone. A single strike on Rosneft's Tuapse 2 refining facility inflicted damages requiring a total $5 billion reconstruction of the plant. Subsequent attacks hit the Shishkaris export terminal in Novorossiysk and chemical production hubs deep within Perm Krai, These precise physical disruptions directly threaten the one-third of the state budget that finances the entire administrative apparatus. During the first quarter of 2026, the domestic economy contracted by 0.5%, forcing independent research institutes to slash annual growth projections to a near-static 0.5%. To meet its current spending targets without triggering severe public spending cuts, the state requires global oil to average $115 per barrel through the end of the year. The actual market price remains tens of dollars below this survival threshold. The fiscal deficit intersects directly with a mounting human deficit on the battlefield. The state currently expends more than $20 million every single day solely on upfront signing bonuses to secure new military recruits. Individual regional payouts surged to a record median of 1.55 million rubles per contract in March 2026. Despite doubling the federal incentive, actual enlistment during the first quarter of 2026 fell 20% below the previous year's levels. The daily intake dropped from 1,200 volunteers to approximately 800 men per day. This intake generates roughly 30,000 recruits per month, a volume that merely replaces the current rate of physical attrition on the front. The state pays historic sums not to expand its operational footprint, but to remain completely stationary. The domestic labor market has processed the unpublicized casualty data and recognized that the financial contract functions as a terminal transaction. As financial persuasion fails to meet the human quota, the syndicate must abandon voluntary incentives for structural coercion. The Ministry of Education recently directed university rectors to ensure that 2% of their entire student body enters active contract military service. The state imposes rigid institutional mandates on large corporations to supply a fixed percentage of their workforce directly to the defense apparatus. The pressure that the system previously exported outward onto foreign territory has completed its pivot, compressing the domestic population into a closed, pressurized chamber where the structural reserves are burning out simultaneously. The physical destruction of refining infrastructure did not merely reduce export volume, it severed the internal circulation of refined fuels. Russian petrochemical facilities rely on Western-manufactured catalytic cracking units and automated control software installed during the modernization wave of the previous decade. Lacking proprietary replacement valves and digital updates, the remaining operational refineries failed to adjust their output configurations to cover the offline units. By late May 2026, the wholesale price of summer diesel on the St. Petersburg International Mercantile Exchange rose by 42% within a 20-day window to suppress an inflationary panic before it reached urban retail stations. The Ministry of Energy prohibited all petroleum exports and imposed rigid domestic price caps. This administrative intervention stabilized consumer prices at the pump, but instantly severed the primary source of hard currency for the nation's remaining non-oil industrial sectors. State-aligned corporations held billions in non-convertible foreign currencies, primarily Indian rupees and Chinese yuan, which could not be legally converted to settle lost domestic tax liabilities or pay local wages. The acute shortage of liquid dollars and euros on the Moscow exchange forced the ruble past the critical threshold of 120 against the US dollar. To arrest the currency freefall, the central bank executed an emergency intervention, raising the benchmark interest rate to 24%. This monetary maneuver arrested the exchange rate collapse for exactly 16 days, but it simultaneously halted the credit architecture of the domestic civilian economy. At 24%, commercial credit became a tool of economic destruction rather than growth. A direct consequence of this interest rate spike was the rapid cannibalization of the civilian manufacturing sector by the defense apparatus. While ordinary enterprises could no longer borrow capital to maintain operations, military factories received unlimited state-subsidized capital at near-zero rates. Armed with unrestricted budgets, the defense sector systematically outbids civilian industries for the dwindling national pool of skilled labor. Tank assembly plants in the Ural region absorbed engineers from agricultural machinery enterprises, causing an immediate halt in the production of components for domestic harvesting equipment. This labor migration, compounded by the direct military requisition of 20,000 commercial freight vehicles, triggered a structural failure within the national logistics network. By June 2026, the state rail monopoly reported a 35% deficit in locomotive operators and maintenance personnel. Over 1,300 freight trains carrying grain, timber, and coal stalled on sidings across the Trans-Siberian corridor. The network could no longer source or replace the specialized high-load industrial bearings previously imported from Northern Europe. The logistics gridlock directly eroded the tax foundations of the federal administrative regions. As local industrial enterprises suspended production due to transport delays, regional corporate tax revenues fell by an average of 28%. Simultaneously, federal decrees transferred the direct financial obligation for funding regional military volunteer units and long-term disability payouts onto these declining local budgets. By the middle of 2026, 42 of Russia's 85 administrative territories entered technical default, unable to cover basic public sector payrolls without federal emergency intervention. The federal treasury met these regional defaults by executing the final liquidation of the accessible portion of the National Wealth Fund. In early 2022, the liquid portion of this sovereign reserve held $115 billion. By May 2026, the non-sanctioned spendable balance dropped below $7 billion. The administration consumed a multi-decade fiscal cushion to fund exactly 18 months of industrial subsidies and local budget bailouts, leaving the central government entirely exposed to any subsequent disruption in global commodities. With the sovereign reserve depleted, the state directed its extractive apparatus toward the final unexploited accumulation of capital, the private savings of the population. Russian commercial banks held approximately 45 trillion rubles in personal retail deposits. To prevent a systemic bank run as real-world inflation tracking reached an annualized 18%, the Prime Minister signed a confidential decree restricting cash withdrawals to 50,000 rubles per individual per month. The withdrawal restrictions primed the final structural trap. A subsequent legislative amendment forced commercial banking institutions to allocate 60% of their private deposit assets into newly issued, non-tradable state defense bonds. This mechanism effectively transformed the lifetime savings of the urban middle class into unbacked government debt, utilized exclusively to finance the military-industrial complex. The capital remained visible on digital banking applications, but its conversion into physical currency or consumer goods became legally impossible. This direct confiscation shattered the core structural compromise that had anchored the regime for 25 years: civilian political passivity in exchange for personal financial security. In municipal administrations from Novosibirsk to Nizhny Novgorod, local bureaucrats faced a mathematical impossibility. Ordered to simultaneously execute federal mobilization quotas, enforce asset seizures, and maintain municipal heating and electrical grids. Without a budget, the local administrative apparatus began to fracture. The system did not experience a visible political mutiny. Instead, its component parts began to freeze up, running out of the structural lubrication that occurs before a state consumes its own foundational architecture. The structural starvation of the civilian sector immediately reconfigured the domestic consumer market into a rigid dual hierarchy. In the defense industrial centers of the Ural and Siberian regions, Wages for specialized assembly workers scaled to 3 times the national average, creating localized zones of intense hyperliquidity. Conversely, in the 92 mid-sized cities devoid of military production, the freeze on private bank deposits and the absolute contraction of civilian retail operations reduced real household purchasing power by 34% within a 5-month window. Because the domestic transport grid prioritized military logistics over civilian supply lines, basic agricultural distribution collapsed, leaving major urban hubs facing acute shortages of poultry, dairy, and processed grains. By June 2026, the state attempted to counter this supply deficit by enacting the Emergency Food Stabilization Decree, which legally compelled agricultural conglomerates to deliver fixed quotas at fixed prices. This administrative intervention produced the precise structural failure seen in late-stage command economies. Producers deliberately slaughtered livestock, early or withheld grain harvests from the market to avoid operating at a net loss, substituting human consumption goods with lower-grade animal feed options to meet the bare legal definitions of the quotas. Food price inflation outside the highly rationed, state-subsidized distribution centers surpassed an annualized 31%, forcing the urban population to allocate up to 70% of its remaining liquid income exclusively to basic caloric survival. This internal economic distortion occurs within a broader framework of absolute geopolitical dependency on Beijing. The structural prohibition on Western transactions forced Russia to route 82% of its remaining resource exports through the Chinese financial and physical pipeline. To maintain this single remaining commercial outlet, the Kremlin accepted a fixed $28 discount per barrel below the global Brent crude benchmark for all pipeline deliveries to the east. Because the Chinese banking system enforces strict compliance with secondary Western sanctions, 80% of the resulting revenue remains locked within Chinese financial institutions as non-convertible digital yuan, usable only for the purchase of pre-approved Chinese-manufactured goods. This mechanism transformed the Russian economy from an independent geopolitical actor into a closed raw material satellite. The state can no longer utilize its international resource wealth to purchase high-precision European manufacturing equipment or critical pharmaceutical components. It can only import consumer electronics and low-tier industrial machinery dictated by Beijing's strategic priorities to guarantee the continuation of this economic survival line. The Kremlin signed a series of 99-year lease agreements, transferring the sovereign administrative and extraction rights of 3 major lithium and copper deposits in eastern Siberia directly to Chinese state enterprises. Faced with this systematic erosion of state capacity, the executive apparatus initiated its most dangerous administrative adaptation, the total criminalization of economic management. A legislative package enacted in May 2026 designated any failure to meet state defense production quotas or any unauthorized industrial shutdown as an act of sabotage against state security, carrying a mandatory 15-year prison term. This measure sought to compel performance through institutional terror, but it achieved the opposite operational outcome. Industrial directors, terrified of personal liability for technical failures and raw material shortages beyond their control, systematically falsified production ledgers and stopped implementing any technical innovations that carried an operational risk. The administrative velocity of the industrial sector dropped to an absolute minimum as managers prioritized bureaucratic self-preservation over actual output. The final systemic fracture has shifted to the domestic security architecture itself. The massive redistribution of corporate assets described in the opening phase of this crisis has created an intensely fragmented elite structure. Fearing that the central authority will execute a second wave of asset confiscations to cover the spiraling federal deficit, The newly enriched proprietor class has begun converting its corporate revenues into private security apparatuses. Under the revised federal defense law, major state-backed corporations received legal authorization to establish independent paramilitary security detachments to safeguard critical infrastructure against external sabotage by June 2026. 14 major resource and manufacturing conglomerates registered distinct, corporate-funded military organizations equipped with heavy armor, artillery, and autonomous drone systems. These private industrial armies outpay the regular federal military by a margin of 2 to 1, drawing the remaining elite personnel away from both the front line and the state security services. The central government no longer holds an absolute monopoly on organized violence within its borders. It sits atop a volatile network of corporate fiefdoms that are armed to protect their stolen assets from the state itself. This structural fragmentation marks the passage beyond the point of systemic return. The human and material capital consumed to secure the initial territorial baseline cannot be regenerated. The birth rate within the Russian Federation has dropped to 1.12 children per woman, the lowest statistical floor recorded since 1943, creating a long-term demographic deficit that guarantees a permanent contraction of the domestic workforce. Even an immediate cessation of hostilities on the external front cannot reverse these internal dynamics. The depletion of the sovereign wealth funds, the total loss of resource sovereignty to external patrons, the systemic conversion of private wealth into unbacked debt, and the militarization of private corporate structures have dismantled the foundational machinery of the state.